Since at least 1943, it was becoming clear that Germany would fold under the pressure of the Allied forces. In February of that year, the German Sixth Army was annihilated at the Battle of Stalingrad, and German hopes for a sustained offensive on both fronts evaporated. Then, in June 1944, the Western Allied armies landed at Normandy, France, and began systematically to push the Germans back towards Berlin. By July 1944, several German military commanders acknowledged their imminent defeat and plotted to remove Hitler from power to negotiate a more favorable peace. In January 1945, facing a siege of Berlin by the Soviets, Hitler withdrew to his bunker to live out his final days, located 55 feet under the Chancellery. The shelter contained 18 rooms and was fully self-sufficient, with its own water and electrical supply. Though he was growing increasingly mad, Hitler continued to give orders and meet with such close subordinates as Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels. He also married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, just 2 days before his suicide. In his last will and testament, Hitler appointed Admiral Karl Donitz as head of state and Goebbels as chancellor. He then retired to his private quarters with Braun, where he and Braun poisoned themselves and their dogs, before Hitler then also shot himself with his service pistol. His successor, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, negotiated an end to the war with the Allies while seeking to save as many Germans as possible from falling into Soviet hands. A German delegation arrived at the headquarters of British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery at Lüneburg Heath, east of Hamburg, on 4th of May. There, Montgomery accepted the unconditional surrender of German forces in the Netherlands, northwest Germany, and Denmark. On May 7th, at his headquarters in Reims, France, Supreme Allied Commander General Eisenhower accepted the unconditional surrender of all German forces. The document of surrender was signed on behalf of Germany by General Alfred Jodl and came into effect the following day. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin wanted his own ceremony. At Berlin on 8th May, therefore, a further document was signed, this time by German Field Marshal William Keitel. Donitz's plan was partially successful, and millions of German soldiers surrendered to Allied forces, thereby escaping Soviet capture. The announcement that the war had ended in Europe was broadcasted to the British people over the radio late in the day on May 7th. The BBC interrupted its scheduled programming with a news flash announcing that Victory in Europe Day would be a national holiday to take place the following day. Newspapers ran the headlines as soon as they could, and special editions were printed to carry the long-awaited announcement. The news that the war was over in Europe soon spread like wildfire across the world. Many people in Britain didn't wait for the official day of celebration and began the festivities as soon as they heard the news on May 7th. After years of wartime restrictions and dangers from food and clothes rationing to blackouts and bombing raids, they were eager to finally be able to let loose and enjoy themselves. Colorful bunting and flags soon lined the streets of villages, towns, and cities across Britain. On the eve of VE Day, bonfires are lit, people dance, and the pubs were full of revelers. A national holiday was declared in Britain for May 8, 1945, in the morning. In the morning, Churchill had gained assurances from the Ministry of Food that there were enough beer supplies in the capital, and the Board of Trade announced that people could purchase red, white, and blue bunting without using ration coupons. Various events were also organized to mark the occasion, including parades, Thanksgiving service, and street parties. Communities came together to share the moment. London's St. Paul's Cathedral held 10 consecutive services giving thanks for peace, each one attended by thousands of people. Due to the time difference, VE Day in New Zealand was officially held on May 9th. The country's leadership wanted to delay the national holiday until peace in Europe had been announced by Winston Churchill. New Zealanders therefore had to work on May 8th and wait until the following day to celebrate. In the Soviet Union, VE Day was also celebrated on May 9th due to the different time zones. Winston Churchill was a man of the hour on VE Day. He had been a major driving force behind the Allies' victory over Nazi Germany, and now that peace had come, the British people wanted to celebrate it with him. At 3 p.m. on VE Day, Churchill made a national radio broadcast. In it, he announced the welcome news that the war had ended in Europe, but he included a note of caution saying, "We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget for a moment the toil and efforts that lie ahead." He knew that the war was not over. Japan still had to be defeated. Later on, Churchill appeared on the balcony of the Ministry of Health building in central London and gave an impromptu speech. Cheering crowds gathered below and he declared, "This is your victory." The crowd shouted back, "No, it is yours." The British royal family also played a central role in London's victory celebrations. Huge crowds of people came down to the Mall of Buckingham Palace, where King George, Queen Elizabeth, and their daughters, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, soon appeared on the balcony to wave to the cheering crowds. In total, the King and Queen made 8 appearances on the balcony, and at one point were joined by Winston Churchill. King George, like Churchill, also gave a radio address. In it, he praised his subjects' endurance and called for a lasting peace. He also paid tribute to those who could not join in the celebration, saying, "Let us remember those who will not come back. Let us remember the men in all the services and the women in all the services who have laid down their lives. We have come to the end of our tribulation, and they are not with us at the moment of our rejoicing." The VE Day celebrations continued well into the night. The largest crowds in Britain were in the capital, but people all around the country took part in the parties, singing and dancing. An estimated 50,000 people were crowded around Piccadilly Circus by midnight. The joy of the day broke down normal social conventions, and people spoke to and embraced those whom they had never met before. Music was provided by gramophones, accordions, and barrel organs, and revelers sang and danced to the popular tunes of the days. The news that the war was over in Europe quickly spread around the world, and people of the British Empire and the Allied countries wanted to celebrate the defeat of Nazi Germany. In the U.S., the victory was tempered with the recent death of President Roosevelt, who had led the country through the war years. His successor, Harry S. Truman, dedicated the day to Roosevelt and ordered that the flags be kept at half-mast as part of the 30-day mourning period. Despite this, there were still scenes of great rejoicing. In New York, 15,000 police were mobilized to control the huge crowds that had massed in Times Square. In Australia, the celebrations were also with a somber mood. The war in the Far East and Pacific was still being fought, and many Australians were serving overseas. But many people still rejoiced in many cities, and services were held in churches around the country to give thanks for the war ending in Europe. In Paris, huge numbers of people flocked to the center of the city to celebrate. An eyewitness recalled, "On the Champs-Élysées, they were singing 'It's a Long Way to Tipperary.' In the Place de la Concorde to the Arc de Triomphe, in the Place de l'Étoile, there was hardly any place to breathe and no place at all to move." Not everyone celebrated VE Day. For those who had lost loved ones in the conflict, it was a time to reflect. Amidst the street parties and rejoicing, many people mourned the death of a friend or relative, or worried about those who were still serving overseas. For many of the widows the war had produced, the noise and jubilation as people celebrate VE Day was too much to bear and something that they could not take part in. There was also anticlimax. The hardships of the war had taken a toll on the people, and it left them with little energy for rejoicing. For members of the Allied forces who were still serving overseas on VE Day, the occasion was bittersweet. Although it meant victory in one theater, the war was not yet over in the Far East and the Pacific. The battle conditions there had been some of the toughest of the war. In May 1945, thousands of Allied servicemen were still fighting in the Far East, and thousands more were held as prisoners of war in terrible conditions.